everyone. Thank you very much for joining this session today. My name is Pranya and I'm with the Ananta Center. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this special session on understanding US-China tech race implications for India. We are truly delighted to have with us today Ms. Manuel, co-founder and partner, Rice, Hadley, Gates and Manuel LLC, and director, Aspen Strategy Group and Security Forum with us today. A very warm welcome to you, Ms. Manuel. I'm also delighted to welcome Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, former Ambassador of India to China, Bhutan, and High Commissioner to Pakistan, and Distinguished Fellow, Ananta Center. Ambassador Bambawale has had a long and established career in the foreign services. He has served as India's Ambassador to China, Bhutan, and High Commissioner to Pakistan. Ambassador Bambawale has dealt with China for 15 years of his long 34-year career and is fluent in Mandarin. Ambassador, I'm so glad that you're chairing this session today. And as always, it is such a pleasure to have you with us. I'm really looking forward to what I'm sure will be really insightful and fascinating discussions. And with that, I'm now going to hand over the floor to Ambassador Bambawale. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pranya. And first of all, let me start by wishing all of you in India and in this part of the world a very good morning. I know that there are some people who are participating from Europe, so it's really early in the morning for them. And of course, those joining us from the United States, including featured speaker today, Ms. Anya Manuel, it's late in the evening for them. So a very good evening to all of you. Welcome to this session, which is titled Understanding the US-China Tech Race, Implications for India. Let me add a little bit to what Pranya has already said about Ms. Anya Manuel. I'm sorry, Anna. She's a former diplomat. She's the author of a very well-known book, which is titled The Brave New World, India, China, and the United States. She's the co-founder and principal in a firm called Rice, Hadley, Gates, and Manuel LLC. I think it's based out of the West Coast of the US, and it's a strategic consulting firm that helps US companies navigate international markets. She's also the director of the Aspen Strategy Group and Aspen Security Forum, and we in the Ananta Center know her very, very well because she has been a participant in the US-India strategic dialogue for several rounds for several years. Let me add one more thing, which is a bit of a personal note about Anya on her CV. I've known her since 2005, if I remember correctly, when she worked at the State Department. And at that time, India and the United States were negotiating the Indo-US nuclear deal. We were on opposite sides of the table, but just as India-US relations came out stronger from that deal, the personal relationship between people, between negotiators on both sides also came out stronger. And I'm proud to say that I've known Anya now for several decades. So a very warm welcome, Anya. Let me just spend a few more minutes on setting the stage. The major development in geopolitics at present is, of course, the heightened, enhanced competition between the United States on the one hand and China on the other. The United States is the existing major power, the existing superpower, if you want to call it, and China is the rising power. So there is a great deal of tension. There's a lot of competition between the two countries. As President Biden in his recent meeting with President Xi of China said, it's time for the two countries, to the two nations, to build some guardrails to ensure that competition doesn't convert into conflict. So having said that, we all know that there's not merely a trade kind of conflict between the two countries, apart from the geopolitical conflict, but what is very important in this competition between the two countries is the technology factor. And we've invited Ms. Anya Manuel to talk about it today. I'm going to invite her to make her opening remarks. She's going to speak for about 10 minutes and then we'll have a conversation. I'd also like to tell the audience that please keep your questions coming throughout the session, right from now if you want to, so that we can take them in a group at the end. I'm going to keep quiet now and hand the floor to our featured speaker, Ms. Anya Manuel.
Gautam, thank you so much for that really kind introduction. It's so nice to be back with old friends, even if it's only on Zoom. May it be in real life sometime very soon. So it's very nice to reconnect with you through this. And of course, we're also connected for another reason, which is we both worked on US-India relations, which seems to be trending in a more and more positive directions. And of course, we each, for our own countries, you for India and me for the United States, worked on Chinese relations. And that seems to be trending tougher. So let me just start broadly, and then we'll zoom in on the technology competition specifically. You know, Washington, D.C. is famously divided these days between Republicans and Democrats. President Xi Jinping has done what no one else has managed to do. He has unified Republicans and Democrats in Washington. I have never seen such unity of purpose and such hawkishness. There is a real worry about China's overreach and a real sense of what's the US going to do to compete? So the Biden administration came in, you know, they've now been in office for 10 months or so. And in Secretary Tony Blinken's first speech, he laid out what he called the collaborate, compete, and confront model. So the idea was, we're not going to be as tough on China as the Trump administration was. We're going to try to find areas where we collaborate, including on climate change and elsewhere. There'll be areas where there'll be competition, and that can be healthy, and that's in technology. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then there are areas where we're going to be in conflict and confronting each other, and hopefully we can manage that conflict responsibly so it doesn't actually turn into a hot conflict. Well, that was the plan, but the plan didn't work out so well. I think the Chinese side didn't quite want to do that. And it was made very clear very soon to American interlocutors that the Chinese side said, look, we're not going to collaborate with you on some things unless we really collaborate on everything. So for example, when Secretary Kerry first traveled to China to reinvigorate the climate change talks, it was really hard for him to get any real progress. Now it got better at COP26, but the Chinese side basically said to the US, hey, we're not going to collaborate with you if we're not going to fix all of these other problems. So that's collaboration. 2, competing. This is really in the technology and economic side, so I'm just going to put it to one side and come back to it. And then confront, or avoiding confrontation. Boy, this is the most dangerous time I have ever seen in US-China relations. You and I were chatting about it in the virtual green room earlier. You know, of course, all the Indian friends on this Zoom are well versed in what's happening in the border, your border with China in the high Himalayas. You know, Taiwan is increasingly worried. In 1 week, there are 150 Chinese fighter jets incursions into Taiwanese air defense zone that the Chinese are just probing and probing. There's more activity in the South China Sea. Now, when you talk to our Chinese interlocutors, they'll say, well, you know, the US is acting provocatively too. It's very scary because it can become a system where it just ratchets each other up. So that's why you rightfully said, when President Xi and President Biden spoke 2 weeks ago, Biden really emphasized putting guardrails around this. Nobody wants a hot conflict with China. It's not in anybody's interest. So hopefully there are now more conversations to calm things down. So let me put that. Why has it been so difficult to get a better relationship with China? I would say there are 2 factors that are really internal to China that the US and India and others can't do much about. 1, the political crackdown has been extreme, and I'll talk about this in a little bit. And 2, the economy is showing a few signs of strain, and I'll get back to that. So the political crackdown, you know, we were also chatting before, I know you're still doing some track 2s with the Chinese. In the United States, that's almost stopped. So I used to do multiple a year. It's very hard to get the Chinese to talk to us now. We were told recently by one of the very famous universities that we had a dialogue with, hey, please don't contact us because we have to ask for permission every time we get an email from you. And by the way, the Central Committee for Discipline Inspection was just here and told us all the different ways that we're insufficiently implementing Xi Jinping thought. So dangerous. Another story, I used to go to China all the time. The last time I was there right before COVID, not one, but two of my friends, where I would normally probably see them for tea at their house, said, oh, we'd love to see you, but why don't we take a walk outside and please don't bring any cell phones. So it's actually becoming very difficult to keep those connections going, even for those of us on both sides who want positive relations. I think that political crackdown, I'd love to hear your opinion too on this, Gautam, but I think I see that getting more extreme in the short run. You know, China has to get through with Olympics, then the Congress in March, and then Xi Jinping will go for a third term in the fall. And what we see is that instead of real interlocutors that used to really have the ear of Xi Jinping and were really honest brokers with the United States, now more and more Xi Jinping is surrounded by yes men, and it's harder for our diplomats to get traction with each other. So that's all very difficult. And the second big trend that I see is that the economy is slowing down a little bit. You know, economic statistics in China are always kind of hard to trust. Growth slowed to maybe 4.9% or something in the third quarter compared to a year earlier. There's been a scarcity of coal, real power cuts, the worst power cuts in a decade. The property slowdown with the financial woes of Evergrande and some of the other big property firms, localized COVID outbreaks that are resulting in really strict lockdowns. And then we're also seeing a little bit of pushback by senior Chinese on some of Xi's crackdowns, you know, the public prosperity push, et cetera. So overall, we from the US side see a pretty pessimistic picture. What's strange is I do so much work with our American companies that do business in China, and there's a real disconnect between the US business community and the policy community, especially the financials, financial firms, because the Chinese have really been rolling out the red carpet to our financial firms. Goldman Sachs was cleared to take full control of its Chinese security business. BlackRock recently told investors they're going to do as much as triple their exposure to China. So there's still a little bit of optimism on the business side in certain sectors, but not in others. That gives you kind of a very big overview to just think through how does the US see China?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anya. I think you have set the stage for talking and going in a little deeper on this entire question of the US-China tech race. So let me ask you specifically that which technologies are the most critical in this kind of competitive environment, competitive atmosphere, which now exists between the United States on the one hand and China on the other? Because we in India, we recently ensured that Chinese companies do not participate in our 5G, in the telecom sector, in our 5G trials and rollout. But could you speak a little bit to the question of which technologies are most critical in this competition?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such an important point because I think in the US, we sometimes define this tech competition as too broad. I personally would like to see the world collaborate on vaccines, on clean technology, on internet things, on education platforms, on some aspects of fintech, right? There's so many areas where we could and should be collaborating. And I think that's been a little bit lost in this time of real confrontation. So here are the 4 or 5 areas that I think are critical. And here, I don't mean to completely decouple necessarily. But in my view, and I sit in Silicon Valley, I work with technology companies all the time. I used to teach about this at Stanford. I think it's important that the United States and our friends, such as India, the Quad countries, the Europeans, stay in the lead in these critical technologies. So one, semiconductors, chips, because they're the building blocks on which everything else in IT stands. Can't do anything without having the most advanced chips. Two, artificial intelligence. That's such a broad rubric, but in a way, you think about that technology kind of like electricity. It's multi-purpose and it'll be in everything. And some of the applications are really harmless and some of them really aren't. So we'd better stay ahead in the race on AI. Three, you already mentioned it, 5G and 6G telecommunications networks, because those, of course, are the rails on which everything else runs. And increasingly, it's not just the smartphones that are in all of our pockets, but it's the Internet of Things. It's the self-driving cars. It's funny, as one auto executive put it to me a few years ago when this sort of push to make sure that maybe Huawei didn't totally dominate 5G around the world was starting. She said to me, oh, I get it, because they could actually theoretically make all the self-driving cars go off the road. I mean, maybe not quite, but it is really important who has the rails on which everything else runs. So that's 5G and 6G. And then I would say behind that are a couple of others, certain aspects of biotechnology, but not all of it. CRISPR, gene editing, some of those things, the genie's already out of the bag, so you can't restrict it. But there's certain areas that are dual use where we should be careful and we should remain in the lead. Quantum, it's a little farther out, but we should be worrying about it. And increasingly, and this is an area where India has leapfrogged the US and the West, and that's financial technologies. And this gets a little wonky, but bear with me. For a long time now, for decades, the US and Europe dominated the international financial payment systems through correspondent banking, through the SWIFT system. It's slow, it's outdated technology, it needs to be replaced, but it's also how we impose sanctions on bad actors. And increasingly here, China is really very, very good. They're really in the lead, you know, between Alipay and WeChat Pay and all of the other apps. You know, India uses them a lot more than we do, but it's really sophisticated and great. And now combine that with the digital yuan, and you could have a situation very soon where, you know, Chinese companies control those rails. So that's not to say they shouldn't, but we should make sure that we stay competitive. By we, I mean India, the US, our friends, in that space as well. So those are, to me, the technologies that are most important.
Thank you. That was illuminating. I, for one, as on a personal note, I feel that we have done the right decision in keeping Chinese firms like Huawei out of our trials and final rollout of 5G technology here in India. Let me ask you, Anya, that, okay, you have identified the technologies which are critical for you know, this competition between the United States and China. But what exactly is the US currently doing on it? We had some clue about this through the Quad meeting, where there was a discussion as well as some outcomes on how the four countries can work on critical and emerging technologies. But what's happening in the United States? Could I ask you that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd love to get back to the Quad because I think it's just impressive how much progress they're making. But US side first, what are we doing? I do think President Trump and his team get some credit for calling out the problem. I think a lot of the world was a little bit naive about what China was doing in the technology space. However, the solution they implemented, to my view, was focused mostly on defense. It was sort of this idea that you could build a moat around US technology and make sure no Chinese investors get in and no US technology gets out. Now, of course, that's not how technology works, right? All of you who are here and work in this sector, you know, India foremost among them, understands that there are international collaborations. You know, the most advanced chips are often designed in the United States, manufactured in Taiwan, South Korea, assembled into all the gadgets in our pockets in China, and then shipped all over the world, right? So this technology has already flown. So building a moat doesn't work. So the Trump administration did some things that were important, maybe a little bit overreach. They tightened restrictions on foreign, but what they meant is Chinese, investment in certain technologies that have national security implications, what we call the SPIES system. And actually a lot of other countries followed suit. A lot of Europeans, I don't know if has India updated its law to that effect? They may have. But so they did that, tougher on investment. They made it harder to export certain dual use technologies to China and encouraged our allies to do the same. But not much was done on what I would consider the positive offensive side. How do we lift ourselves up instead of just trying to keep the Chinese down? And so the Biden administration has come in and they recognize this and they're trying to do something about it, but it turns out it's hard. So still more of the actions are defensive because that's what our system knows how to do. Stringent export controls, keep Chinese investment out, make it harder for Chinese students to come study. It's a little bit of a hodgepodge of policies, not through anyone's fault, but because the US government doesn't really have the existing tools. We're not organized for this. You know, I sometimes informally chat with friends in the Commerce Department about this. And Secretary Gina Raimondo, who's doing an excellent job, says, gosh, I'm as close as we have to a tech minister because we don't have one, right? So we're really not set up for this. That makes it hard. And finally, many Trump era policies are a little bit overbroad and they're stuck because the Biden administration has been very slow to get people in place in these jobs that are going to make the big, difficult political decisions. So that's on what's happening on the defensive side. On the positive, building ourselves upside, actually a lot is happening. So the Congress recently passed a very big bill that used to be called the Endless Frontiers Act. It's billions and billions of dollars going to more research and development in the most advanced technologies. There's a part of it that's called the CHIPS Act that has specific subsidies for bringing some fabs, these factories for semiconductors, to the United States and also doing more R&D. So this is amazing. I mean, I've been writing about this for several years. 2 years ago, no one would have imagined that we would do this. So that's on the positive side, I think is going quite well.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Anya. I have been told by the Taiwanese, and I think you know it for a fact, that their chip maker, their semiconductor giant TSMC is building factories, one in the United States, one in Japan. So here you have developments where there's a shortage of chips right now across the world, and we're beginning to feel the impact of that. What I'd like to do at this point, Anya, if you permit me, is there are a few questions from the floor. So I'm going to build that into our conversation, if you permit me. I have a few questions of my own, which we'll come to. But since there are some linked questions, let me just read that out to you and ask you to answer those questions. The first is by Sujit Samadar, who is, of course, formerly from the Indian Navy. He's worked with international companies here in India. And he says that what is the US policy on containing Chinese investments into innovative tech startups? Also, the question of Chinese students, which you referred to, the question of Chinese students into PhD programs at leading universities in the United States, because that is a source for leaking technology to China. So can I ask you, about this issue?
Good question. And I sort of touched on it briefly in my last response, but just to get more detailed, what we call the SPIES Law, which is our law that allows the US government to look at certain investments by foreigners in US tech companies, was strengthened in 2017 and 2018. And they're now taking a much closer look even at venture capital investments, including in sectors that are sensitive, like the ones we talked about, semiconductors, AI, certain other things. The kinks need to be worked out because right now what's happening is there's just a lot of saying no, as government is sometimes want to do. But honestly, more caution was real. I have friends out here who wrote actually a very good report on how much investment there was in young startups here, especially AI startups by the Chinese, and then they would take out the IP and bring it home. Understandable. That's what I would do too if I was China. But we've become much more careful about that. On PhDs, students, researchers, this is a really difficult issue that requires a nuanced policy. And the US government is never very good at nuance. You know, we're the country of John Wayne. So there are reported and documented cases of some Chinese researchers and students spying at universities. It's real, it's happening. It's a minority of those students, a small minority and of those researchers. And a lot of them are here because they just want to learn and they want to do the right thing and they want to collaborate and they're not spying for their government. So the Trump administration cracked down pretty hard, sent the FBI out, told universities to basically be extraordinarily careful. A little bit of that was okay, but to the point where now you've had some prosecutions where it turned out that the Chinese researchers had done nothing wrong. So we just have to get the balance right here. And I think Indian universities probably have a similar situation. You know, we're built on openness and collaboration is a good thing. And actually you get the best science when you collaborate. I recently wrote a paper on this with our former physics dean at Stanford. And he told me that even at the height of the Cold War, he was collaborating with Soviet scientists on theoretical physics. That's a good thing. We shouldn't shut those things down. We shouldn't keep Chinese and Indians and American researchers away from each other, but we also shouldn't be naive. So we haven't quite gotten that policy nuance right, but we're working on it.
Yeah. You know, when I was reflecting on what you've been saying about students from China who come to the United States, I find that the bulk of them actually return to China, whereas many Indian students then stay on, and some of them, there's yet another Indian origin CEO of a major US company, Twitter, I believe, in the last few days. So
they run all of our tech companies.
So thank you for stay on and go on to head some of your companies. But I'm speaking of that on a lighter note, Anya. So just bear with me. But let's shift gears a little bit. We have focused on, you know, the tech race. We have focused on the kind of technologies that are important to the US. We have focused on what the United States is actually doing. Let's shift gears and look at China, Anya, because you know China very well. What's happening in China? We read a few weeks ago that there was a major meeting of the Politburo or the Politburo Standing Committee on quantum computing, for example. And yet at the same time, over the last few weeks, over the last few months, we have had a major crackdown on tech companies in China. So can you interpret for us what exactly is happening there? We don't know what to make of it. That on the one hand, you are focusing on high tech and innovation, and in the other, you're cracking down on the people who are good at this, on the big companies and big names in China. So please help us in understanding that, Anya.
Absolutely. I'm glad you raised it. In the US, we have an expression called killing the goose that laid the golden egg. Right? So, you know, these Chinese tech companies are truly innovative, really impressive, and some of them are being really strangled by the Chinese government now. So the tech decoupling isn't just on the side of the US and friends, it's on the Chinese side too. And I see three big trends here. One is a real focus by the Chinese government on national security. So that's, you know, made in China 2025, the dual circulation model, increasing China's technological self-sufficiency because they're worried that they won't be able to rely on the rest of the world forever. This means, you know, standing committee meetings about quantum computing. It means huge subsidies to the industries they care about, especially semiconductors, you know, 5G, we know that story well, some parts of AI, some parts of biology. They're really doing a lot to build up their own industry. The 1,000 Talents program, getting Chinese scientists, as you said, to come home and build things there. So that's all building ourselves up, as the Chinese would say. 2, there's a second trend, which is the dominant goal, as I see it, of preserving the Communist Party's control at any cost. This is, so the Communist Party of China can rule for another 100 years. And it's sometimes in conflict with innovation, right? So that's where no new approvals for online games, limiting gaming to a few hours a week, sweeping data security laws, the new personal information protection law, just goes on and on. It's just been a sea change that we've seen really just in the last 10 months, right? And some of the Chinese companies don't know what's going on. A lot of, well, I'll get to this in a second, and then the third big trend I see is President Xi's campaign to improve common prosperity, because there are huge income disparities in China, as you know well. You were ambassador there. Chinese tech companies are now being encouraged to give billions in charity. They're scrutinizing the IPOs of major tech companies. And there are some really specific ones, like just this week, the Chinese government said Tencent isn't allowed to update its existing apps or launch any new apps until there's more control put in place, right? They've asked Didi to come up with a plan to delist in the United States. I mean, it's really extreme. And I see this, I don't know them closely, but I interact with some of the Chinese tech CEOs, and a lot of them have quietly stepped down in the last 6 months. So people are saying, gosh, I don't quite know how to handle this. I think I'll just get out while I can.
Very, very, very interesting, Anya. But the question that comes to my mind is that it was the Chinese Communist Party and its leaders, probably not Xi Jinping, but the earlier leaders, who ensured that these companies grew and became as big as they are, whether it is Alibaba or whether it's Ant Financial or so many of the others, Didi Chuxing, etc., etc. But when they become big, then they become a threat to the Communist Party of China. And so, as you rightly said, and as you said, that the measures being taken at present are basically to cut them down to size. Why will that not happen in other areas of tech or innovation? Is it because it's being concentrated in the public sector, in the state-owned enterprises? And will those sort of state-owned enterprises actually be able to innovate like private companies or private sectors does? What are your thoughts on that, Anya?
No, I think that's a really important point. Look, the tech companies, the really big ones that you mentioned, Ant Financial, Alipay, Tencent, Didi, these guys were so enormous, and they really operated. I mean, I'm sure you met a lot of the leadership there. It's sort of, we used to joke that it's right out of Silicon Valley or Bangalore Central Casting. Everybody looks the same. Everyone has their hoodies and their flip-flops and talks the same and is into IT. They were just really competing on the world stage. And I think they became very hard to rein in. And so hence the crackdown there. Other sectors haven't been as uppity as wanting to take matters into their own hands. And it's partly because more state-owned enterprises are involved. It's partly because there's a lot of government funding, like for biotech and elsewhere. Even in AI, when you dig into the details, a lot of the young AI startups in China have a huge amount of data that they get from the government. So that makes you pretty beholden. I mean, that would never happen in the US. Like Shanghai, for example, made available to this very young AI startup all the biometric information on 25 million citizens, right? That would never happen here. So then you're kind of beholden to the government if they're giving you that kind of a leg up. So it isn't happening equally in all sectors. You're right.
Okay. Let me ask you a related question, Anya, which is, it's my thinking. I don't know if you agree with me, but the Chinese economic miracle, which we have experienced 4 decades of double-digit GDP growth, under the, not leadership, but under the broad rubric set by Deng Xiaoping, was based on decentralizing economic decision-making, taking it down to the people, to the agricultural worker, to the industrial worker, to the individual industries. Now, Xi Jinping is re-centralizing not merely political power, but also economic decision-making. What impact do you think that's going to have on the Chinese economy?
Yeah, I see that trend exactly as you do. You know, the Chinese economy was roaring because it was decentralizing, and it actually, you know, was socialist in name only. It's like the most capitalist place on the planet. If you've ever competed with the Chinese, you know, they really know what they're doing. And I do think this is going to hurt growth, but he seems not very worried about it, at least in the short run. But I think it really will hamper the Chinese economy. And that gets into another big trend. It goes right in the maw of another big trend, which is the demographic challenge that they're about to have. You know, India, you're about to reap your demographic dividend from all the young people who are now being educated. And China, it's slowing down much faster than anyone anticipated. And so I think those two trends could be worrisome for the Chinese economy in the medium term.
Okay. And then, of course, let's come to the big question. You know, our conversation today, our discussion today is on understanding the US-China tech race, implications for India. So how does India fit into all of this? You've described the technologies, what the US is doing, what's happening in China. How does India fit into all this? Is there something that India and the United States can do together on the tech front?
Yeah, bringing it full circle. And I'd love to get your view on this first, but I see two big things happening. In some ways, one, India is benefiting. The supply chains, the tech supply chains that used to really run only through China are starting to move out. Apple has moved 10% of the iPhone 12 assembly to India through Foxconn, Pegatron, others. Amazon, Samsung have quietly moving production to India, all good trends. I think a quarter of the world's Fortune 500 companies have set up shop in India. That's all a good thing. And there's certain areas where you're leapfrogging. You know, I talked about fintech before. It's pretty amazing. Your domestic companies are doing extraordinarily well and people trust them more. So it's almost easier for an Indian technology company to become really international than for a Chinese one. So I think in that sense, India is benefiting. Two, the joint policy work between the US and India on these things has just recently accelerated. So, you know, I watched the Quad meeting very carefully. I'm sure you did too. A lot of pronouncements on what we're going to do together on tech. And I always, you know, you and I are veterans of this. You always kind of take them in stride and think, well, let's see what they actually do. Well, on tech, they've actually stood up 3 of these working groups. So on cybersecurity, there's a senior cyber group. The idea is to implement shared cyber standards, develop secure software, and from what, you know, protect all of our Quad infrastructure. So Australia, Japan, India, and the United States from attack. I think they're already meeting, which is great. Something's actually moving. Yeah. That's one. 2, there's a semiconductor supply chain initiative, and that's actually starting work too. How do you bolster supply chain security across these different countries and make it more resilient? Because even with those big sums I talked about, you know, the US is about to spend $40 billion trying to get some of these semiconductor fabs back to the US. That's only 4 or 5 months of capital spend for this industry. So you're not going to move the whole industry back, but you can move 5 to 7% of production of certain chips where you don't want to be totally reliant on TSMC in Taiwan and elsewhere. So that's 2, that's happening. And finally, you know, 5G deployment. There's a Track 1.5 dialogue that's run by Open RAN, which is this network of companies that's trying to really move into the new technology on 5G and kind of disintermediate some of these companies like Huawei, and that's working. So boy, I think that's really impressive progress. I don't know how you see it.
No, I look at it very similarly, Anya, because what I was really excited about from the last meeting of the Quad was the announcement of this fellowship. 100 scholars, 100 students from the 4 countries, 25 each, the brightest minds from the United States, India, young minds from the United States, India, Australia, Japan, being able to come together, study together, will really, I believe, lead to a lot of innovation. And I was very, very excited with that idea of a fellowship for students from Quad countries to study at universities in the US. I think it will have medium-term to long-term positives for the relationship. And as you rightly said, in other areas too, there has been, significant movement forward. However, I'm going to ask you a question which does reflect thinking in India. And this question has been raised by Kiran Karnik, who is a techie himself, has run technology companies, NIIT and others. And here's what a group of people in India feel. And I'm going to read out from his question, which is online, that Ambassador Bambawale, despite the India-US strategic partnership, the US has never really shared any serious tech with us. It's a longer question, but I'm going to stop there. That's you get the main point. There is a segment of opinion in India which thinks on these lines. So how do you react to that, Anya?
Yeah, so I do understand that this is a sensitive point in India, and I think we've actually made huge progress. So, when you look at the export controls, the defense issues, how much we've sorted out, we now share as much with India pretty much as we do with Europe. So, we're moving in the right direction on all these things. And the India nuclear deal, it's a particularly sore spot for you and me since we spent so much time on it. I'd love your view on why you think it hasn't been fully implemented, but I don't think it hasn't been fully implemented because the US was not willing to share technology. I think there were a lot of other issues around liability and how expensive American technology is versus French and Russian, and then Fukushima happening and the world sort of moving away from nuclear. I really hope that with real security safeguards and environmental safeguards, there can be a small nuclear renaissance. Because when you look at what we haven't talked about yet, COP26, climate change, I still don't see, even 12 years after you and I worked on this deal, how we get to net zero without a real step up in safe nuclear power if we can make it safe. So I would love to hear your views on why it hasn't been implemented.
Yeah, no, my view is basically that in the nuclear area, of course, we have run into difficulties, we have run into roadblocks. I think everyone knows what those roadblocks are. The liability issue is a huge question. But I think there are possibilities in other areas of tech, and you mentioned them, whether it's AI or whether it's quantum computing, where the US and India can actually work together, and we should be looking at working together. I think the governments are giving the lead, but this would actually come from universities, academicians, private sector, etc. So we need to have greater interactions between the peoples of the two sides. But of course, the governments also need to be on board. And with that, let me raise a point which has been pointed out by a former colleague of mine, Ambassador Suresh Goel, who served with me many decades ago in China. He asks whether we could discuss a little bit about the strategic implications of the tech race itself. What would it mean for global security? How would global security be impacted? What are your views on this issue, Anya?
Yeah, that's a huge question and an important one. In the most basic security sense, if technology carries over into national security technology, so the country or countries that are ahead in the tech race tend to be the most powerful on earth, right? Chinese gunpowder, British steam ships, Roman roads, right? The countries that lead in technology really tend to lead the world and also become the most powerful militaries. You see our US military, when I talk to them, I talk a lot about innovation. We're really working hard on, and frankly, struggling to modernize from this great 20th century enormous military to something that's much more nimble, because of course the threat will be asymmetrical, right? We have this wonderful satellite communications capability. Well, and now there's a lot of anti-satellite weapons. Pretty easy to take down those satellites. What do you do then, right? We have these really big aircraft carriers. Maybe they're sitting ducks with certain types of AI automated drone technology. So these are, from a purely security standpoint, that's where the technology race comes in. But I think it also comes in spying. It also comes in exporting our ideology. We haven't talked about that yet, but China is really doing a lot to export its surveillance technology around the world in a way that I find really worrisome. It's Orwellian. You spent a lot more time in China recently than I did, but every time I go, I'm shocked at how much more surveilled I feel. Cameras everywhere, put your fingerprints in it, where you walk through Tiananmen Square and they're, face scanning you. The social credit system. It's not a society I would like to live in. And so part of the tech race is also about setting the standards for technology and the democratic and ethical standards for technology.
Right. Anya, I've been in the recent past, especially after what China has been doing on India's northern borders since April or May of 2020, so well over a year and a half now. But I have been arguing that, ideally, when there are two major powers competing with each other, the smaller countries or the other countries, because India is not small from a population point of view, but the other countries ideally would like to sit on the fence and not take sides, wait and see which of the two major powers wins out in this battle. But I think given the nature, what you've just pointed out, given the nature of the polity in China, and given the nature of the polity in India and the United States, where we share so many common values, I believe that India cannot sit on the fence and must take sides. And we have done that through the Quad and through many other, other structures that have come up in the recent past, including with France, the United Kingdom, which are also major democracies in the world. So I was just thinking about that, and I thought I'd put that into the mix right now.
Yeah.
But
Can I ask you on that, because it's such an important point? Do you think that view, I mean, you and I have been friends a long time. Do you think that view that India must take sides is more common now? Is it dominant, or is it still a minority view?
No, it's not a dominant view at all, Anya. In fact, you mentioned earlier that there's a disconnect in the United States between the thinking in the corridors of power in government on the one hand and in industry on the other. I think there is this huge gap in India too, between the thinking of the government on the one hand and, say, the economy, the industry on the other. In fact, this year, 2021, India-China trade has already reached its highest ever level of $100 billion by the end of October 2021, and 2 more months to go. So you can see that a lot of sourcing continues to be done from China, but I think it will take time to find alternate sources for India to begin to manufacture some of these items itself. But I can definitely, there was a question in the chat box which said whether India and China could mend fences so that they could work together in the areas of AI, etc. And my answer to that kind of question is that, look, by moving their troops in large numbers to the border with China, with India. The Chinese have indicated what kind of relationship they want and desire with India. They want a relationship where China, India, and other countries will have to take a much lower kind of position in this power structure in Asia. So I think themselves indicated that they do not want to work with this. This is a purely Chinese century in their eyes. And India will have to take that as a given, and we will have to respond accordingly. We will have to, I won't use the word alliances because that's a bad word in India, as you know, but we'd have to build our coalitions with other democracies in the world, whether they're large like the United States and Japan, whether they're small like Bangladesh, and South Korea. So that's my view, but it's not widely held.
Yeah.
Let me pick up. How can India and the US pragmatically cooperate and work on capacity building to tackle Chinese cyber attacks? You spoke about spying. Recently, a few months ago, there was a cyber attack through the power sector in Mumbai, in Bombay. So how can India and the US pragmatically cooperate in tackling Chinese cyber attacks? That's one of the questions in the box.
So important. And I think we can do a whole lot better. So I talked about the senior cyber group. I'm not privy to those conversations. Maybe there's already a lot more collaboration than I know about. But look, I see this just from the US side. We're not great at this yet. We, for example, have no way yet for US companies to report attacks on them and then not be liable in our legal system for the attacks. You should be, it's getting better, but it's not perfect. You should, in an ideal world, I would say, boy, if there's a nation state attack on one of our companies, we should let the government know. The government should know how to respond. If the government sees an attack in one of our systems, they should be able to warn industry. Like even that collaboration isn't good yet. If we could get that better and then also bring it to our friends, because we see so much of what's going on in all of these systems, you could warn people, right? And you could come up with a common response. And you could say, hey, by the way, knock it off. And it's not just one country saying it, it now has the force of the world saying it, which we're not always speaking with one voice.
In the area of defense, there's a question by Neelam Matthews. She asks that in defense, what areas does China have an advantage over the United States? Will this make a difference in border conflicts with India? So let me ask you that question, that in the area of defense, where does China have an edge or an advantage over the United States as of now, as of today?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And it's a heated debate in Washington right now, because our generals have really sounded the alarm, especially about this recent hypersonic missile test that the Chinese did. I'll tell you, I'm not quite sure how to credit it, because the Chinese military is so untested that you actually just don't really know what they're better at. Their last conflict that they really fought was in the 1970s. Xi Jinping has done a lot, as you know, Gautam, to modernize the military. It's very interesting, actually, when you read Chinese military documents, in certain ways, they're trying to copy sort of the best of what the US did, like have a DARPA, which is our research arm, have an In-Q-Tel, and work more with universities. This concept of civil military fusion, where the private Chinese companies really work with the defense establishment in a way. And I think here it's possible that the Chinese have an advantage, but it's not insurmountable. Our US tech companies are often very hesitant to work with the US government, which is strange because, Silicon Valley was basically built on collaboration between the Pentagon and the tech companies out here. But currently it's very much not in vogue. So that's a long-winded way of saying no one really knows. Chinese military technology is expanding very rapidly. I don't quite think they've caught up yet in any area, but boy, it's large. The expenditures are increasing. And I know on the US side, at least, people are quite worried.
True, absolutely true. And definitely what you have said makes a lot of sense. Also, we ourselves are seeing, the fact that the Chinese military forces are now much more integrated in their strategic commands, in their structure, that we're beginning to see this playing out even in the India-China border areas. And we ourselves are waking up to the fact that there needs to be much more jointness of operations between the different parts of India's defense forces, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the missile commands, etc. So absolutely, I think, Anya, we are coming to the end of the time allotted to us. I think it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you and listening to you about the US-China tech race, implications for India. You asked some time back whether there is a widespread opinion or feeling in India that the two countries, which is India on the one hand and the United States on the other, should be doing more together. Yes, there is a feeling that we should be doing more together, but there's also a feeling that India needs to fend for itself, that we need to be Atmanirbhar, which is the latest, terminology here, needs to be self-reliant to a certain extent. And self-reliance, of course, doesn't mean economic autarky. It means dealing with the rest of the world, but also beginning to look out for yourself. And I think that is what will actually stand India-US ties, whether in the tech area or in other areas, in good stead. So let me bring the conversation to an end, Anya, by thanking you profusely for spending so much time with us, especially given the time zone. It's very late at night on the West Coast of the United States. Thank you for staying up for this particular session on the US-China tech race and implications for India. And with those words, let me hand it back to Pranya for her final words before we close the session. Thank you so very much, Ms. Anya Manuel.
Thank you. Gautam, always such a pleasure to see you and converse with you. Thank you.
Pranya, over to you for the final words, please.
And Anya, it was such a pleasure to have both of you with us today. Really such a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much. And with that, we close this session.